My name is Emily Voss. On my wedding day, my mother-in-law stood up during the toasts and handed out manila envelopes to every single guest in the ballroom. 238 people, 238 envelopes. Inside each one, a photograph of me, photoshopped, standing next to a man I had never met in my life, and a printed letter in her own handwriting, claiming I had married her son for his money, that I had been unfaithful for years, that I was not the woman she pretends to be. She did this during the father of the bride speech. She did this with my own uncle standing at the microphone because my father was dead. She did this in front of my mother, Linda Voss, who works retail and had saved for 10 years just to attend. She did this on purpose, and she did it with a smile. That was 18 months ago. Tonight, my mother-in-law is 63 years old. She has been removed from every charity board she ever sat on. She has a federal tax lien against her property. She has been quietly asked to never come back to her country club. And she is no longer on speaking terms with 3 of her 4 closest friends. Her name is no longer in the social pages of the magazines she used to call her magazines. She has lost everything that defined her, every single thing, and the entire collapse, every single domino, was set in motion by me, quietly, legally, surgically. If you have ever been humiliated in public by someone who thought you were powerless to fight back, sit with me for the next 20 minutes because what I'm about to tell you is exactly how a quiet woman with the right skills can dismantle a queen. My name is Emily Voss, and this is the story of how I burned my mother-in-law's empire to the ground without ever raising my voice. Let me tell you who I am. I'm 31 years old. I work for a forensic accounting firm in Boston called Hartman Forensic Group. My job, in the simplest possible terms, is to find what people are hiding inside their finances. Companies hire us when they suspect fraud. Lawyers hire us when they're prepping for litigation. Federal agencies hire us when they need an independent investigation. I am by training and by temperament a person who finds buried things. I grew up in a town in central Pennsylvania that nobody's ever heard of. My mom, Linda, worked retail at a department store for 31 years. My dad, John Voss, ran a small auto body shop until he died of a heart attack when I was 19. I went to a state school on scholarship. I worked 2 jobs through college. I graduated summa cum laude with degrees in accounting and economics. I joined Hartman at 23. I made senior associate by 28. I met James Whitfield 3 years ago. He worked for a private equity firm I had done an investigation for. We met at the closing dinner. He laughed at my jokes. He asked good questions. He drove a normal car. He ordered the second cheapest wine on the menu because he said the cheapest one always looks suspicious. I liked him immediately. What I didn't know, until our third date, was that James came from one of the oldest, wealthiest families on the North Shore of Massachusetts, the Whitfields, the name on the new wing of the local children's hospital, the name carved into the marble plaque at the country club, the name embroidered into the donor benches at the symphony. James was, to his credit, embarrassed by all of it. He had built his career deliberately away from his family. He paid his own rent. He drove his own car. He told me on our 4th date that his mother was complicated and that I should manage expectations when I met her. I should have listened more carefully. I met Margaret Whitfield 3 months into our relationship. She invited us to Sunday dinner at the family house, a 12-bedroom estate with a circular driveway and a man named Henry who answered the door in a white jacket. I wore a dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I brought flowers. I called her Mrs. Whitfield until she told me, with a tight little smile, to call her Margaret. Within 10 minutes of sitting down, she had asked me 3 questions. "What does your father do?" "My father is dead." I told her this. She said, "Oh, I'm sorry. What did he do?" "What school did you attend?" "Penn State." She made a face that was almost, but not quite, sympathetic. "And how nice that James is dating outside his world." That was the first sentence she said to me when no one else was listening. I knew, walking out of that house, that Margaret Whitfield was going to be a problem. I did not yet know how big a problem. For the next 2 years, Margaret ran a quiet, sustained campaign against me. It was never overt. That's the thing about women like Margaret. They don't yell. They don't insult. They don't slam doors. What they do is erode. She would invite James to Sunday dinner and forget to mention me. She would bring him on family trips and tell him there wasn't room for me. She gave me for Christmas a self-help book titled Building the Marriage You Deserve, which is the kind of gift that's so deliberately cruel, it loops back around to almost being funny. She introduced me at parties as James's friend Emily. For 18 months after we got engaged, she told James repeatedly that I was lovely, but maybe not quite the right fit for the family. She told James's sister that she was worried about Emily's background. She told James's grandfather, who has dementia, that I was the girl who's after the money. I bit my tongue. For 2 years, I bit my tongue. James kept saying, "She means well. Just give her time. She'll come around." I want you to remember that sentence. She means well. Just give her time. That sentence is how women like Margaret get away with what they do. When James proposed on a hiking trail in Vermont with a ring his grandmother had left him in her will, I cried. We called everyone we loved. My mother screamed for 45 seconds straight on the phone. We called Margaret last. Her exact response on speakerphone while I was sitting next to James was, "Oh, honey, are you sure? You've only known her 2 years." James went quiet. I went quiet. The engagement, from that point forward, was a battlefield I had not signed up for. Margaret took over, not asked, took. She booked a venue without telling us. The country club her family had been members of for 4 generations. She announced this at a dinner, like a fact. She hired a wedding planner named Elise Donnelly, a friend of hers, who would not return my phone calls but would call James directly. She booked a caterer I had never met. She picked the flowers. She suggested my dress designer. She added 112 people to the guest list without consulting me, including her ex-husband's new wife, whom she despised, apparently just to spite him. When I tried to push back, James would say, "Emily, please, just let her have this. It's her only son's wedding. She means well." That sentence again, so I let her have it. I told myself, the wedding is one day, the marriage is forever. Pick the battles that matter. I let her plan a wedding I didn't want, at a venue I didn't know, for a guest list of people I'd never met. I told my mother to come a day early so we could have at least a few hours together that didn't involve Margaret. I picked out the only thing she let me pick out, my own bouquet, and I told myself it would all be over in 12 hours. The night before the wedding, at the rehearsal dinner, Margaret raised her glass for a toast. She said, "To James and Emily, may this marriage be everything you both deserve." I should have caught it. The way she said deserve, like a knife sliding sideways, I should have caught it. The ceremony was beautiful. I'm going to give Margaret this much. The venue, the flowers, the music, all of it was beautiful. She had taste, even when she was being cruel. My father walked me down the aisle in spirit. My mother walked me down in person. James cried during the vows. We kissed. We danced our first dance. We cut a cake that cost more than my mother makes in 3 months. Everything was going perfectly until the speeches. My father's brother, my Uncle Tom Voss, was supposed to give the speech my father couldn't. He had been practicing for 3 weeks. He had handwritten note cards in his jacket pocket. He had just stood up. He had just raised the microphone when Margaret stood up at the head table. Margaret was not on the schedule. Margaret was not supposed to speak. But Margaret had a microphone of her own, a wireless one that nobody had given her. And she said, "Before we go on, I have something I want to share with the family." The room turned. 238 people, plates of dessert in front of them, champagne glasses lifted halfway to their mouths. I knew. The second she said those words, I knew. There were 3 young men, caterers, I had assumed, moving through the room. They were not caterers. They were carrying boxes. From the boxes, they pulled manila envelopes. They began handing them out, one to every table, one to every guest. I watched my mother, Linda Voss, who had saved for 10 years to come to this wedding, receive an envelope, look at it, and look up at me with the kind of confusion I will carry to my grave. Margaret continued, "There are some things about my new daughter-in-law that I think the people who love James deserve to know." I looked at James. James was looking at the floor. My father-in-law, Charles Whitfield, looked at his wife with an expression I have never seen on a human face. Somewhere between embarrassment and helplessness and a kind of stunned, white-faced silence. People started opening the envelopes. The photographs were not real. I want to be clear about this. They were photoshopped. The man in them was somebody who had been edited into pictures of me. The letter was Margaret's handwriting. The dates on the back were fabricated. But the room didn't know that. The room saw photos. The room saw a letter. The room saw a mother-in-law standing at a wedding, exposing her son's new wife as a fraud and a gold digger and an adulteress. My Uncle Tom dropped his microphone. My mother stood up. James stood up, slowly, and looked at his mother. Margaret looked at me. She smiled. That's the part I will never forget. She smiled at me, like she had been waiting to do this her whole life. I picked up my bouquet. I picked up my mother's hand, and I walked out of my own wedding in my dress. James didn't follow me for 40 minutes. I sat in the bridal suite at the country club with my mother on one side and my Uncle Tom on the other, in a wedding dress that cost more than my college tuition, with a phone that was ringing every 2 seconds. And I made a decision. I was not going to file for divorce. I was not going to scream at Margaret. I was not going to file a defamation lawsuit, which a lesser woman would have done in a week. I was going to do what I do for a living. I was going to investigate. And then I was going to take everything Margaret Whitfield had. The Monday after the wedding, I walked into my office and I did not tell anyone what had happened. I requested 2 weeks of paid leave for personal reasons. My boss said yes without asking questions. He has known me long enough to know what that meant. I did not go on a honeymoon. I went home, I set up a second laptop, I opened 3 different browser tabs, and I started doing the only thing I know how to do. I started building a file on Margaret Whitfield. Here's what most people don't understand about investigating somebody powerful. You do not start with the obvious thing. You start with the boring thing. The boring thing for Margaret Whitfield was the Whitfield Foundation, a charity she had been running for 19 years. It distributed grants to art programs in the Boston metro area. It threw a gala every fall. It was the centerpiece of her social identity. I pulled the public 990 forms. Charities have to file them. They are publicly available. Anyone can read them. It took me 6 hours to find the first irregularity. A consulting fee of $240,000 in 2018 paid to an LLC with a Delaware mailing address. I cross-referenced the LLC. The LLC was owned by Margaret's sister, Vivian Pierce. I kept looking. Over the next 10 days, I built a 14-page memo on the Whitfield Foundation. The numbers were ugly. Over 6 years, approximately $1.6 million in consulting fees, art acquisition fees, and event production fees had been paid to entities I could connect through 3 or 4 layers of shell companies directly back to Margaret personally. She was running a charity laundromat, cleaning her own money, skimming donations. This was not the kind of thing you do to a former retail worker's daughter without expecting consequences. But I was not done. I kept looking. The second thing I found was harder. It took me 4 weeks. Margaret had been having an affair, 5 years, maybe 6, with a man named Robert Kane. Robert Kane was, and you can't make this up, Charles Whitfield's college roommate and lifelong best friend. He was also the godfather to James's older sister. I found it through hotel charges. Margaret was sloppy. She had used a personal credit card that James had been paying off for her, a card he had been told was for household expenses, to book hotel rooms in Newport, Rhode Island, 12 times in the last 2 years. Always the same hotel? The Vanderbilt? Always 2-night stays? Always when Charles was traveling? I subpoenaed nothing. I broke into nothing. I read public records, social media check-ins, and the credit card statements James had access to, because he had been a co-signer on the card his entire adult life. The third thing took me 3 months. The third thing was the source of the Whitfield family money. The Whitfields presented as old money. Several generations of New England wealth, the social pages said. But when I started digging through old SEC filings, the kind nobody reads, the kind that have been sitting in archives for 35 years, I found something. Margaret's father, Theodore Pierce, had run a private investment fund in the 1980s. In 1987, that fund had collapsed. 211 investors, mostly elderly retirees, had lost everything. The fund had been a Ponzi scheme. Theodore Pierce had been investigated. He had been indicted. He had died of a heart attack 3 days before his trial in 1991. The case was dismissed. The settlement to the victims was pennies on the dollar. Margaret had inherited her father's estate. Margaret's old family money was Ponzi money. I had what I needed. I did not act for 60 days. I want you to understand why. The mistake most people make when they have leverage is using it too soon. They want the catharsis. They want the satisfaction. They want to walk into a room and watch the person who hurt them break. That is amateur. The professional move is to stage the dominoes, drop them in the correct order, let each one knock down the next until the whole structure collapses without you ever having to be visible. I called a friend. Her name is Anna Reed. She is an investigative reporter for a regional magazine called the Boston Quarterly, a real publication with editors, lawyers, and a fact-checking process. She had written about the Whitfields before, sympathetically, from the social pages. I told Anna I had a story. I gave her the affair file first, not the charity, not the Ponzi history. The affair. Why? Because the affair was the story that was going to detonate Margaret's social world. The charity was the story that was going to detonate her financial world. The Ponzi history was the story that was going to detonate her identity. You release them in that order: affair, charity, identity, and each one weakens her ability to defend against the next. Anna ran the affair story in March. 4 months after the wedding, it ran with photographs, with hotel records, with a quote from Robert Kane's wife. Anna had gotten Robert's wife to talk on the record because Robert's wife had been suspicious for years and had been quietly building her own file. The story ran on a Sunday. By Monday morning, Margaret had been asked to step away from her charity board for personal reasons. By Tuesday, Charles Whitfield had moved out of the family estate, quietly, into a hotel. By Wednesday, Margaret had called James, screaming, demanding to know if I had been involved. James said no. James lied for me. That's the part of this story I will never tell you in detail, what James said and did during those months. Because James was, and is, a good man who was raised by a complicated woman. And what he did during those months is between him and me. But he chose me. 3 weeks later, the second story dropped. Anna had spent her own time confirming my charity findings. She brought in a financial analyst. She filed FOIA requests. She did everything by the book. The Whitfield Foundation laundering story ran in May. It ran on the cover. By June, the IRS had opened a formal investigation. By July, the foundation had been dissolved. By August, Margaret had paid a settlement of just over $400,000 in back taxes and penalties to make a federal case go away. And a federal tax lien had been placed on her residence. That same August, the third story dropped. Anna had found a researcher in Connecticut named Dr. Elias Brand, who had been working on a book about the 1987 Ponzi case for 15 years. He had files. He had names. He had stories from the victims who were still alive. The story ran in a national publication. It included an interview with the daughter of a man named Walter Petrov, who had been a Boston area dentist. Walter Petrov had invested his entire retirement, $90,000 in 1986 money, in Theodore Pierce's fund. He had lost everything. He had died in 1994 in a one-bedroom apartment, surviving on Social Security. His daughter in the story said, "The Pierce family never apologized. The Pierce family kept the money. The Pierce family kept everything they took from my father, and they used it to build a life of charity galas and country clubs and college tuition for their grandchildren." After that story, 3 of Margaret's closest friends, women who had defended her through the affair, through the charity scandal, through everything, stopped speaking to her. You can survive a lot of things in Margaret's world. You cannot survive being old Ponzi money, pretending to be old shipping money. Margaret called me one time. It was October, 11 months after the wedding, 5 months after the third story. She called from her landline. I didn't recognize the number. I picked up. "It was you," she said. No preamble. I waited. "Wasn't it?" she said. I said one thing, very quietly. I said, "You handed out envelopes at my wedding, Margaret. Did you really think I wasn't going to send you anything back?" She hung up. She has not contacted me since. Charles Whitfield divorced her quietly in November. He had been waiting for an excuse, I think, for years. The country club, in January, sent her a letter informing her that her membership would not be renewed. The letter cited general unsuitability of conduct. The Boston social magazine that used to feature her every quarter stopped calling. Margaret moved out of the family estate in March. Charles got it in the divorce. She bought a townhouse 40 minutes outside the city. She lives there alone now. Her son speaks to her on holidays. Her daughter does not speak to her at all anymore, for reasons that have nothing to do with me, that came out during the divorce, that she had been hiding for years. I cannot fix what Margaret did to me at my wedding. I will never have that day back. My mother will never have that day back. My Uncle Tom, who passed away last summer, never got to give his speech, but I will tell you this. When Margaret Whitfield was 63 years old, she was the queen of her world. When she was 65 years old, she was a woman in a townhouse with a federal tax lien, no friends, no charity, no husband, and a son who couldn't quite look her in the eye. And every single piece of that, every single domino was set in motion by me, sitting in a bridal suite in a wedding dress, on the worst night of my life, deciding that I was not going to scream. I was going to investigate. I want you to understand what I learned in those 18 months. The people who hurt you in public are counting on your shame to keep you quiet. They are counting on the fact that you'll cry into your pillow, file for divorce, post a sad caption on Instagram, and disappear. Don't disappear. Get to work. Find their files. Find their lies. Find the things they have buried for 30 years and pull them, patiently, slowly, surgically, into the daylight. Don't yell. Don't lawyer up the obvious way. Don't go on Facebook and write a 1,000-word rant. Find a journalist, find a public records database, find the small things that connect to the bigger things. Build a file, wait, release in the right order. And let the people who hurt you watch the world they built, the world they were so sure you couldn't touch, collapse, one beautiful brick at a time. That's what I did. That's how I'm still standing. My name is Emily Voss. And that's how I dismantled the queen who tried to humiliate me at my own wedding. If this story hit you somewhere, if you have ever been humiliated in public by someone who thought you were too small to fight back, hit subscribe. We post a new story like this every single day on this channel. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your mother-in-law handed out envelopes at your wedding, walked out, confronted her, or something else? I read every single comment. I'll see you tomorrow.